for a whale, but their maneuverability and ability to respond is much higher. But once again, speed is important, although the damage to the whale might be less in the case of these small vessels. And one of the issues here is that we do not have much data available to determine what the impact of these smaller vessels even is. But in reading records of voyages, even sailboats have had a lot of issues with hitting whales, especially at night. And sailboats, because they don't have a motor, they're very silent. And so this is an ongoing problem even for these type of vessels. So here at Pacific Whale Foundation, we have been conducting a study here in Maui using observers on board of our whale watch fleet to sort of try to look at this problem from the perspective of slightly smaller boats. The observers on our whale watch boat record all whales present within a 1 kilometer radius of the vessel during scan periods, and also record every occurrence of what we call a surprise encounter. So the map on the top, in orange, all those dots are all our encounters with whales during our operations during last year's season. And there are small triangles in red, which unfortunately you might not be able to see very well, that are our surprise encounters during that time. And what we define as a surprise encounter is basically a whale that pops up at about 300 yards, we call it 300 meters, or less from the boat in a radius around the boat. So this is just our definition. And basically we call it surprise encounter because the crew did not detect this whale until it surfaced that close to the boat. But does it mean that because we are surprised, there is anything, does this has anything to do with damage to the probability that the whale is going to be hit? Well, that's what we are trying to get at. So 300 yards seems like a good distance away for an evasive maneuver, but once again, speed is an issue. And we found that that speed did determine the frequency of our surprise encounters, and more surprise encounters occurred at higher speeds, although our vessels limit their speed to 15 knots during whale season, so we don't have a lot of data at higher speeds. So a surprise encounter does not necessarily mean there is a collision, and basically it would depend if a near miss or a collision was possible on where the whale surfaced around the boat. And we figured that there's really an area in front of the vessel that it's more critical to explore, because this is an area where there's a higher risk of collision. And we call this an area of near miss, where you're more likely to have a significant encounter with a whale. Whether you hit the whale or not depends on a lot of different factors. Now, what we are working on is trying to model what that angle is. And if you remember what I showed you in that study of the whale model and the ship model, the beam of the boat in that study was important. So basically, how wide that angle is of where the whale is going to be affected is going to depend on how wide that boat is. And it may vary with different vessels. And that is why modeling that angle is pretty difficult. Also, what we found, and what other studies have found, is that surprise encounters are more likely to involve subadults and calves, an already vulnerable portion of the whale population. And in fact, in our data, 8% of the surprise encounters were subadults and 18% were calves. And this statistically was significant because this proportion was higher than the proportion of subadults and calves in the larger population. What does this mean in terms of subadults and calves? Well, the behavior of subadults and calves is generally different around boats, sometimes because of the inexperience of these animals with boats, their higher curiosity, perhaps, for boats, and also their tendency to swim more awkwardly in the first few weeks of their life. And also a tendency for a calf to pop up at the surface because it doesn't have as high a breath-holding ability as an adult. And so all these factors may contribute to the vulnerability of these animals. Also, we talked a lot about speed, but what we know the least about and what we need to know more about is the whale behavior and how it plays a role in these strikes. And there's really hardly any data on this. Ultimately, whales are individuals, and the set of life experiences and learned behaviors they have accumulated during their lifetime may play a large role in whether they approach, avoid a boat, or have experience with near misses themselves during their lifetime. And there are also species-specific differences in behaviors that may play a role in whether a population is more or less vulnerable to ship strikes. And we know that northern right whales and right whales in general, being a more slow-swimming, surface-loving whale than other whales, has a tendency to be a little more vulnerable to ship strikes than other species. Also, one of the things that we have tried to do in our study is to model the ability of the operator to avoid the collision. And this turned out to be a pesky problem for our group. What we did is we talked to our captains, to our experienced captains, and asked them how they perceived the distance to the whale and their ability to maneuver and avoid a whale at particular vessel speeds. And based on their answers and based on our data, we generated this graph, which models the probability of near misses on the y-axis in relation to boat speed, and I have an arrow here, boat speed, and in relation to the distance of a surprise encounter to the boat. And as you can see, it's a three-dimensional function, which is very complex because even our captains' answers were very varied, and their perception of their ability to avoid a collision with a whale actually differed, and their perception differed with different, not at the same speed. Different captains reported different abilities to really stop the boat, to really turn the boat in time to avoid the whale. And so this curve kind of depicts that complication, and we have tried to use this function to insert in our models to model the uncertainty that we have, and we're still kind of working on this problem. And there are other factors that are really important that are also very difficult to model. So for a vessel operator to avoid a collision with a whale, they first must detect the whale, and then they must maneuver to avoid the whale. Well, there are other factors at sea that may play a role, such as sea conditions. Sea conditions not only make your driving a little harder and your ability to maneuver a little harder, but also make it harder to see a whale even at a short distance from the boat. And in fact, even with flat, calm seas, your ability to detect a marine animal that comes to the surface to breathe only at intervals is sort of a function of the distance of that animal from your boat. And for marine mammals, there's even other factors, such as the fact that they dive most of the time. And so even near the boat, your probability of seeing that animal is not 100%. And so you have to use this set of probabilities in your model to try to figure out how this will affect your probability of near missing or hitting a whale. So ultimately, we have a responsibility towards these animals to understand this problem. But also, science is always much slower than conservation measures need to respond with data to these issues. And some decisions need to be made with what is available now, even if the data is not perfect. Because science is going to take a much longer time than is needed. And the question for all of us in terms of ship traffic and behavior at sea is how much are we willing to give up for their sake, and how much effort are we willing to make to understand this issue better. So I'll leave you with that question to ponder, and mahalo nui loa to all of you for joining us tonight, and I think we're going to have the panelists up here for your questions shortly.